Hello everyone, let's get underway for lecture 4. Today we begin the second dialogue that we are reading in our class from Plato, Plato's Apology. So just looking forward a little bit, we've just finished talking about the Euthyphro in our last lecture, and we're going to tie up a few loose ends with regard to the Euthyphro today. We're going to talk about the Apology in one fell swoop for today's lecture. And then starting on Monday of next week, we are diving into Plato's Republic. So we're moving pretty fast. We're getting quite a bit of Plato all at once, but I hope that you're still enjoying it nonetheless. So let's get underway. So today, well, if I can get this work. Okay, there we go. So today's list of things to do is first, we're going to talk about what we've learned about the classical conception of philosophy from our reading of the Euthyphro. Then we're going to turn to the Apology proper, and we're going to focus our discussion really on the first half of the dialogue. We'll talk about the charges that are brought against Socrates, about what they are. We'll talk about Socrates' strategy in responding to these charges, and then we will end with basically an outline of what Socrates is suggesting philosophy is, and what he is suggesting the value of philosophy is in the Apology. But before we dive in, I think it would be helpful for me to give you a little bit of advice on how to treat this dialogue and this lecture in your own study. So, sorry, hold on a second. Let me look at something here. Well, never mind. That's not going to work. I was going to try to do something with my screen, but don't worry about it. So here's how I think you should approach reading this text and studying it. First, read the text all the way through before watching this lecture. So if you're watching the lecture, you haven't read the Apology yet, then stop, get away from your computer, or at least get away from this video, and open up the Apology and read it all the way through. You can read it quick, that's fine. I just want you to read it all the way through. Then come back to this video and watch it, and then go back to the Apology again and read the first half, right, up to the point where I am talking about in this lecture, the point where Socrates gives his definition of philosophy. Okay, sorry. So that's what I want you to do with regard to the text in this lecture at this point. All right, let's dive in. So first, as I said, we're going to be talking about what we've learned about the classical conception of philosophy, or more specifically about the Socratic and Platonic conception of philosophy from our reading of Plato's Euthyphro. Remember I said that the Euthyphro is a dialogue in which Plato is putting philosophy on display in the actions of Socrates, right? So what is Socrates doing in the dialogue? It can be answered in one word. He's philosophizing, right? So what I want to do in order to get a better sense of what he's depicting philosophy to be, I want to carefully observe Socrates' actions in the Euthyphro. So that's really all we're going to focus on in the first part of the lecture today. What exactly was Socrates doing in the Euthyphro? And we're going to start with some of these flat-footed observations, right? Just sort of like, this is something that any passive observer looking at this situation with Socrates and Euthyphro could see, okay? But it's important to keep these things in mind because it's easy for our own sort of like assumptions and our own reactions to what Socrates is doing in the dialogue to sort of cloud our vision of these very obvious things, okay? So the first thing is that clearly Socrates is attempting to learn what Euthyphro really believes about piety and justice. Right? The whole dialogue centers around what is Euthyphro's belief about justice. Now, the reason that Socrates approaches this in the way that he does is because he's convinced that that whenever you profess that you believe something, you are at least implicitly signaling to the person that you're talking to that you have some reason for thinking that what you believe is true. Okay? So suppose you were to ask me if I believe, say, that my bike is is right outside the front door. Okay? And suppose I responded by saying, yeah, I believe my bike is right outside the front door. And you ask, well, why do you believe that? What are your reasons for believing that? Suppose I responded by saying, I don't know. I can't think of one reason why that would be true, right? In doing that, there's a kind of tension there, at the very least. I mean, I would be totally baffled by someone that responded in that way. And that's important, because what it signals is that there's something there's an intrinsic relationship, and I shouldn't say intrinsic. There is a intimate relationship between believing something and having reasons for thinking that something is true, right? If you believe something, that means, we might say, that you have reasons for thinking that what you believe is true, right? And this entails that you have a clear understanding of what it is that you believe, and you have a clear understanding of the reasons for why you believe it. Okay, so clearly Socrates is trying to get Euthyphro to state what he believes in a clear, complete manner, right? To give his full set of reasons, to give a full statement of what he believes, as well as a full set of his reasons for why he believes that, right? And the idea is that he will that these reasons will ultimately be convincing, right? Okay, so he's attempting to learn what Euthyphro really believes about piety and justice. He's also constantly helping Euthyphro to formulate his own beliefs about piety more clearly. In doing that, he's helping Euthyphro test his beliefs for truth, right? And this ties back to what I was saying just a moment ago about how Socrates thinks there's an intimate connection between professing belief about something and implicitly claiming that you have some reason for thinking that what you profess is true. He's also obviously helping Euthyphro to realize something about himself, namely that Euthyphro can't clearly state what he believes about piety, right? So these are four flat-footed observations that I think any passive observer of the series of events that's laid out in the Euthyphro could see, okay? Now, there's one important thing I want us to consider in relation to this, right? And it has to do with Euthyphro's own understanding of himself, right? I mean, it could be the case that the reason Euthyphro can't clearly state what he believes about piety is that he might not really have any coherent picture of what piety is. And so he really might not have a coherent belief about what piety is. In fact, he might not even have a belief at all. But for some reason, he doesn't realize this about himself. Okay? Now, granted, this does sound like a paradoxical kind of situation to be in, where you say, I believe that piety is what all the gods love, but at the same time, you don't really have that belief, and you don't really know what it is that you're saying in saying that, right? That sounds like, at best, this could be a situation that happens only in very special circumstances, very rarely, right? But I think that part of what Socrates is trying to show Euthyphro is that even if this is a special and rare situation, which, by the way, as we'll see at the end of the lecture today, Socrates thinks that we're probably really fundamentally confused about what we believe most of the time. Even if this is a rare situation, Euthyphro happens to be in it, right? He doesn't really know what he believes. Okay, so let's turn to a more subtle question that'll bring out a more subtle observation alongside the flat-footed observations that we've just made about what Socrates is up to. This is the question, is Socrates simply trying to make Euthyphro look like a fool? Or is he just messing with Euthyphro's head? Because it certainly looks like it, right? Well, my answer to this question is, I think not, and here's why, right? Socrates clearly rallies valid concerns about the coherence of Euthyphro's view, right? It's not like Socrates is simply being confusing or like simply raising a dust without any clear idea as to why he's dissatisfied with what Euthyphro is saying. I mean, the reasons he formulates for Euthyphro to sort of call into question his own beliefs are valid, right? And we looked carefully at the logical structure, right, of his objection to the third definition of justice. Of piety. I'm already thinking about the Republic and justice, right? I'm really eager to get there. But his objection to the third definition of piety, as well as his very careful analysis of the fourth definition of piety, right? So it seems like he has valid concerns. Another point under this same heading is that he does do a lot to try to help Euthyphro formulate what he believes, right? It's not like he is doing this just to ridicule Euthyphro or make fun of him, right? He keeps trying to goad Euthyphro to state what he believes in a clear manner, and he also tries to help him out, right? Offering tips, offering different methods that he might utilize to try to clearly state what he believes, right? So that's one reason to think that Socrates isn't simply messing with his head, right? He seems to be genuinely trying to help him. Also, Socrates, if you look carefully, claims time and time again that what he really cares about in all of this is the truth of the matter about Euthyphro's views, right? He wants to know the truth about what Euthyphro believes, both in the sense of understanding what Euthyphro believes, and also in the sense of understanding whether Euthyphro ought to believe that. Right? So he wants to test the truth of Euthyphro's beliefs, that is, understand whether Euthyphro really ought to believe that. And he also wants to understand what Euthyphro believes in the first place, so that he can test it. Right? And these are not the actions of someone who's merely messing with you, right? Not like a mean big brother who's merely messing with you, at least on the face of it, right? Okay. Here's another more subtle question. Okay, it goes, so why should we think that Socrates is helping Euthyphro realize what he believes if Socrates really doesn't think that Euthyphro has a coherent view to begin with? Isn't that a kind of messing with him? Isn't that a kind of manipulation of him? Right? I mean, why doesn't he just come out and say, Euthyphro, you don't know what you're talking about, son. Let me show you the path to the truth, right? Why doesn't he just do that? Well, I think the answer to that question is because it's really not that easy to disabuse someone of this kind of confusion, right? The thing that Euthyphro is confused about, namely his understanding of piety, is clearly something very important to him. In fact, it's so important to him and so central to the way that he sees himself and the world around him that he's willing to do something that his entire community sees as wrong-headed, right? So Euthyphro's really going out on a limb here. So clearly Euthyphro must be really committed to whatever he thinks piety is, right? And you're not going to get anywhere with someone who has this kind of commitment to a belief by simply going up to them and saying, look, buddy, you're just wrong, right? Think about it like this. How many of you have, whether you're religious or not, right? How many of you have passed by a street preacher who's preaching a fire and brimstone sermon about how everyone is a sinner and everyone needs to turn to God and you're a sinner, and you're a sinner, and you're a sinner, right? Something like that. There's really, I think, one of two reactions that most people have to someone who's doing this. One of them is to simply ignore them and be like, well, okay, I mean, they're saying that I'm fundamentally confused about the way that I'm living my life and that I need to repent and go to church or something like that, or maybe change the way that I go to church or change the way that I think about my faith. Okay, that's fine, but I'm just going to ignore it, right? So that's one reaction. Another reaction is someone who actually thinks about what the person is saying, but the whole time is thinking, well, the person that's really confused here is not me. It's rather this guy, right? This guy who's preaching at me, he's the one who's confused, not me, right? And in fact, if we were to sit down, I could actually tell him how he's so confused, right? I mean, what both reactions indicate is that at the very least, it's not easy to try to point out a confusion that rests at the heart of someone's view of who they are and of how their world is, right? You can't just approach someone and tell them they're wrong about this. It won't work. The confusion, at the very least, will be resurrected as a kind of shield or as a kind of lens through which they will see everything that's going on, through which they will hear everything that you are saying. And it'll mute it. It'll color it, so in such a way that they won't really be able to understand why you're worried about what they believe in the first place. So what this indicates is one cannot just directly address someone who has a confusion like Euthyphros, right? Rather, one has to, as it were, approach them from behind, right? As one who's not really out to show Euthyphro that he doesn't know what he's talking about, but rather as one who takes the position of the student, right? As the one who's there to learn. Because then, at the very least, Socrates can be in a position to help Euthyphro arrange his own beliefs around himself in such a way that he can see for himself that he doesn't know what he's talking about. That he can see for himself, through his own working through of his own beliefs, that he was confused to begin with, right? I think Socrates is convinced that this is the only way to go about trying to disabuse people of these kinds of massive underlying confusions about their view of themselves. So let's take stock at this point, right? If everything that I'm saying about what Socrates is doing in the Euthyphro is correct, then we can take one key upshot from it, that we can see clearly that Socratic philosophy has one key task, and that is to disabuse people, other people primarily, because that's what Socrates does, of massive underlying confusion by helping them to arrange their beliefs around themselves in such a way that they can see the confusion for themselves, right? So it does away with this confrontation and accusation that someone else doesn't know what they're talking about, or that someone else is dead wrong about who they fundamentally are, right? Rather, it puts the other position it puts the other person in a position of active engagement with their own beliefs, right? Which I think Socrates believes is the only way that we can ever make headway on this kind of task of helping to unroot massive underlying confusions from other people. Okay, with that said, let's turn to the Apology. Remember that in the Apology, Plato is using Socrates both as someone who's exhibiting philosophy to us and as giving an explicit account as to what philosophy is. Now, what I want to focus on today, which happens primarily in the first half of the dialogue, is Socrates' explanation, his explicit definition of what philosophy is. Now, even this explicit definition comes up in a rather indirect manner, so we're going to have to do some work to try to see it in the text. But that's going to be my focus. If you want to take a look at the second part of the text more carefully after watching this lecture, I think that what's happening in the second part of the text is that he's having Socrates put philosophy on display again. I mean, what he does through the course of the dialogue is, of course, he engages with Meletus to try to get Meletus to see, the person that's bringing the charges against Socrates, to try to get Meletus to see that he doesn't really know what he's talking about. And then, if you read the very end of the dialogue, he actually accuses the jury of not knowing what they are doing in sentencing Socrates to death to begin with. Because, he argues, the jury doesn't really know whether death is good or bad, and so it seems like they really don't know what they're doing in sentencing Socrates to death, because they're assuming that they know something that they really don't, namely that death is actually a bad thing, right? So I think Socrates is putting philosophy on display in the second half of the dialogue. But I want to focus on the explicit statement of Socrates, of philosophy in the first half. Okay, so let's take a look at the charges that are raised against Socrates. At the beginning of the dialogue at 18b and 19b, he distinguishes two sets of accusations. One that is raised by what he calls his early accusers, and the other that's raised in the formal indictment that's brought by Meletus. His early accusers really, this isn't a well-defined set of accusers. It's rather more like a body of rumors that's going around Athens about him, right? So there's not one designated group of people that's the early accusers. It's just the rumors that are going around Athens that are about Socrates. The second set of accusations, however, the formal indictment, is very well defined, and it's clear who's bringing this indictment. Namely, it's Meletus and the people who are supporting Meletus. And Socrates actually indicates more clearly, as we'll see in the course of the dialogue, who he thinks the support system behind Meletus actually is. But let's take a look at the statement of these two accusations in Socrates' own words. He says that the rumors about him say, "There is a man called Socrates, a wise man, a student of all things in the sky and below the earth, who makes the worse argument the stronger." The formal indictment by Meletus, on the other hand, says Socrates is guilty of wrongdoing in that he busies himself studying things in the sky and below the earth. He makes the worse argument. He makes the worse into the stronger argument, and he teaches these same things to others. Now, I think that there's an important way in which these two sets of charges overlap. I think that really there's a fundamental way in which they're saying exactly the same thing. And so that's what I've done here on this page. I've tried to compile and simplify the three key charges that are being raised in both of these sets of accusations, right? So one of them is the claim that Socrates is a sophist. Hold on a second. Let me look at the next slide. Oh yeah. Okay, that's how I go about it. I had to remind myself how I go about analyzing, how I go about talking about this list. Because there are many ways that I can do it, right? So, okay, so the first one is that Socrates is a sophist. And that's what he means whenever he says that people are calling Socrates a wise man. Or that he's someone who teaches people to make the worse into the stronger argument. Okay, that's what it means to be a sophist, basically. The second charge that Socrates studies nature and that he holds unorthodox beliefs about the gods. And the third charge is that Socrates makes the worse argument into the stronger. Okay? Let me say a little bit about what it means to be a sophist really quickly, because I don't talk about that in any of the slides that are to follow. A sophist in ancient Athens at this time was actually a formal job. Sophists were basically itinerant teachers. And they would go about the city selling their services to rich families. And what they would do is to basically train the sons in these rich families in the art of rhetoric, poetry, mathematics. That way, these sons could be prepared to take over and carry on the legacy of these families. So sophists are basically just itinerant teachers, okay? Um, so anyway, that's all I need to say about sophists, okay? So again, the three charges: Socrates is a sophist, Socrates studies nature and holds unorthodox beliefs about the gods, and Socrates makes the worse argument into the stronger. What we need to consider at this point is, which of these three charges is Socrates really most concerned about? Which is the one that he spends the most time trying to refute? Because that indicates the one that he thinks is the most dangerous. So we can look at this merely by kind of measuring how much time he spends on each claim, right, on each accusation. Well, he answers the claim that he's a sophist at Stephanus page 1920c, 19c through 20c, right? So very little amount of time is given to that. And you can take a look at the passage there to see what he says to try to refute the claim that he's a sophist. He addresses the claim that he holds unorthodox beliefs about the gods at 24c through 25c, basically by arguing that Meletus has no right to bring up this kind of accusation against him to begin with, because Meletus doesn't know what he believes about the gods, right? So that's the way that goes. So he's clearly not very concerned about that charge, nor is he concerned at all about the claim that he studies nature. In fact, he never even denies that throughout the course of the dialogue. Here, hold on a second. Take a look here. Okay. But so what he does do is spend a lot of time, in fact, the majority of the first half of the dialogue is focused on refuting the third charge, okay? So that's the one we're going to focus on, and it's in his addressing of the third charge that he articulates his definition of philosophy, right? Now, it would be helpful to pause here a moment and consider, okay, what does it mean to make the worse argument the stronger? Okay, well, they characterize it, I mean, basically it's characterized in a few different ways throughout the course of this dialogue. And clearly what he has in mind here is what Plato depicts other sophists in other dialogues as doing, okay? And sometimes even openly professing that this is what they do, right? To make the worse argument the stronger is basically to make the truth seem false, or to make the false seem true through argumentation, through rhetoric and dialectic, right? Another way to think of it is if you know something about formal logic, if you've taken a logic class, then you'll know the words sound and unsound, valid and invalid, and what those words mean. But basically, if you put it in these terms, you could say that what it is to make the worse argument the stronger is to make unsound arguments that compel people to believe something, right? Is basically to put forward unsound arguments. The third way we can put it is just a very basic way that kind of gets at the basic gist of it, is that basically it's to manipulate people with rhetorical tricks, right? It's to manipulate people into thinking certain things are true that are actually not through clever use of rhetoric and words, okay? So how does Socrates respond to this charge? Well, notice that he does not spend a lot of time directly denying the third charge, say by raising a bunch of evidence against the claim directly, right? Rather, what he does is he tells a story explaining the origins of this rumor about him, right? Now, in this section of the text at Stephanus page 20c through 23c, he is addressing the first set of charges, right? Which, remember, is just a set of rumors. So it makes sense that he could try to address this rumor by showing where it came from, right? And he thinks that by showing people what caused this rumor to come about, they will then be able to see for themselves that the rumor is false, okay? So how does that work exactly? Well, let me give you an example. Let's see. Suppose that there's a rumor going around about I don't know, like a prominent politician, that this prominent politician is in some way fraudulent, right? Maybe this prominent politician wasn't actually born in the country that he serves in. And let's suppose that being born in the country that this politician serves in is a necessary condition for holding the political seat that he does. Okay? Suppose that rumor is floating around the country about this politician. Well, how could this politician refute this rumor? Well, of course, one way that he could try to refute the rumor is by, I don't know, producing his birth certificate and giving it to the media and saying, hey, look, here's my birth certificate, which shows that I was born in the country where I serve. Okay, that's one way he could do it. But you may notice, I mean, that one way that the rumor mill could respond to this is by saying, well, maybe that birth certificate isn't legitimate. Maybe it's a forgery, right? Something like that. Okay, so another way that this person could respond is by using the same tactic that Socrates is using here. He could instead try to say, okay, look, I'm not going to deny directly what the rumor says. The rumor is false, of course, but what I'm going to do instead is tell you where this rumor came from, right? And he could tell a story in this case by, I don't know, something like, let's imagine that there's an opposing political party that thinks that they can sow enough doubt about the legitimacy of this politician with this rumor so that they actually put this rumor out there. They sort of filter it in. They put it into social media. They put it into certain parts of media, just enough so that it starts to float around, and then it sort of catches and gets spread around, right? Like rumors do, right? Suppose that they know that that will hurt this politician, right? So one thing the politician could do to try to counteract this rumor is by telling the story about how the rumor came about. By saying, okay, look, the opposing political party knows that my constituents really like me, and what they're trying to do to get me out of my seat is to plant this rumor about me into the cultural psyche so that hopefully they can get some competitive edge against me in the next election, right? Something like that. So that's basically what Socrates is doing with this origin story of the rumor. He's trying to show that the origin story of the rumor is such that when we understand the story, we'll see clearly that the rumor about him is false. Okay? Now, if you haven't already, at this point you would do well to stop the video and carefully read Stephanus pages 20c through 23c, where Socrates tells this story about the origin of the rumor that he is one who makes the worse argument the stronger. Because what I'm about to do in the following part of the lecture is go really quickly through this story and make some pretty high level observations that you'll really only understand if you have the story fresh in your mind and you kind of have the text there in front of you and you can see what I'm talking about. So go ahead and do that. Pause the video and carefully reread it. Oh, getting another phone call here. Sorry to interrupt your reading. Okay, so let's get underway again. Now that you've read that again, I want to make these observations about the story. So here's the basic structure of the story. First, he claims that the rumor that he is one who makes the worse argument the stronger comes from the fact that Socrates has what he calls human wisdom, and that's at 20d. He discovered this, that he has human wisdom, when the oracle at Delphi said to one of Socrates' good friends, who's a rather eccentric guy, that Socrates was the wisest man alive. And what Socrates did is he went out to try to refute the oracle by trying to find someone wiser than himself. This is what he says at 20e through 21b. But he failed to find anyone. This is what he's saying at 20c through 22e. Now, his going about trying to refute the oracle, trying to gather evidence that he's actually not the wisest man alive, made him very unpopular with a lot of powerful people. That's what Socrates says at 23a. And what he suggests is that this rumor is basically these people, this powerful people's way of trying to retain their reputation for wisdom, right, against Socrates' public demonstration of the fact that they really aren't wise. Okay, so that's the basic structure of the story. Now, here are some really key points from the story that will help us to better understand what Socrates and Plato really think philosophy is. The first key point is that Socrates' wisdom, what Socrates calls human wisdom, consists in the fact that he knows nothing worthwhile. That's the way that he puts it in the text that we just read. And he says that knowing that he knows nothing worthwhile, which is what he calls human wisdom, right, is better than the position of a person who is reputed to be wise, right? Because and he identifies three specific groups: the politicians, the poets, and the craftspeople, right? He says that all of these people, all of these classes in our city are people who think they're wise, but they're really not, right? So they're like me in that they really know nothing worthwhile, but they're unlike me in thinking that they actually do know something worthwhile. So in a certain sense, Socrates knows more than these other people. But the thing that he knows is not anything outside of himself. It's rather something about himself, namely that he knows nothing worthwhile. Whereas these other people, they don't know this about themselves. And so that makes Socrates wiser than these other people. So what he discovers is that there's actually a sense in which the oracle was right? Socrates has human wisdom, all these other classes in the city don't have it. So that means they're worse off. It's also important to note that of these three, the craftspeople are in the best position, right? So of the people who lack wisdom, the craftspeople are in the best position since they, as Socrates puts it, knew things I did not know. And to that extent, they were wiser than I, right? But what's wrong with them is that they ruin this benefit that they have by thinking that their wisdom, say, in making things out of wood, if they're a carpenter, or in growing plants out of the ground if they're a farmer, that for some reason being an expert in growing tomatoes also makes you an expert in everything else, right? He says that's what these craftspeople do. They think that if they can make lots of money, that must mean that they think if I can make lots of money, that must mean that I'm also wise in everything else, right? And that's where Socrates thinks they fall into trouble. That's whenever they start to think that they know things that they actually don't, right? Okay, so it's sort of like these craftspeople have a very limited domain of expertise, or we might even say wisdom, right? Insofar as they know how to do something and they have good reasons for doing what they're doing, right? They're experts in that. But they think that their expertise in this limited domain also makes them experts in everything else, right? And that's where they become unwise. So with this, I think that we can begin to sketch a general outline of what Socrates thinks philosophy is. And we can do this by zeroing in on three things that Socrates says are called wisdom, right? So notice, just because something is called wisdom doesn't mean that it is wisdom. And notice, of these three things that I have represented on this slide, there are two that are kinds of wisdom, namely human wisdom and divine wisdom. However, blameworthy ignorance is not actually a kind of wisdom, even though it is often called wisdom by people in the Athenian community. And that's a problem, right? That, by the way, is really where Socrates thinks many of the problems with his community and with other people lie, right? In the fact that they have blameworthy ignorance, but they call it wisdom, right? So let's take a look at this list of traits that distinguishes each from the other, and then we can get to a pretty concise statement of what philosophy is. At least, let me take a look at the next slide to make sure. Yeah, okay. So human wisdom, note, The person who is humanly wise has three characteristics from what Socrates says in the dialogue. Basically, it's that they have some skill or they have some know-how, right? Like Socrates, in calling himself humanly wise, never denies that he can do a lot of things and that he can do a lot of things really well, right? He's a stonemason, so he can build things out of stone. So he's basically one of these craftspeople, right? He can obviously speak Attic Greek very well. He can do basic mathematics, and he can do lots of things, right? So he has some skill or some know-how. But what he realizes about himself, and what he means whenever he says that he knows nothing worthwhile, is that he lacks a full account of this skill or of this know-how, right? So while it is the case, right, since Socrates is a stonemason, right, he could give an account of his decisions as a stonemason, right? So if he's, if he's building a house out of marble and he decides to chisel the marble in a certain way, then he could give an account as to why he does that, right? We could ask him, hey, Socrates, why did you cut the marble in this way? Why did you do that? He could explain that to us. He could give us good, convincing reasons as to why we, if we wanted to build a good house out of marble, should also chisel the marble in that way, right? So with regard to a very limited domain of things, right, he has an account of his skill. But whenever it comes to everything that he can do in his life, to the full range of skills that he has in his life, with that, he realizes he lacks a full account, right? Like, if we go back to the Euthyphro, we recognize that Socrates and Euthyphro both have this intuitive sense of what piety is, right? They're sort of like pretty reliable trackers of piety in the world around them. But whenever it comes to giving an account of what piety is, of what this thing is that they can sort of sniff out and be like, oh yeah, that's piety, I can see it. But whenever it's asked, okay, well, what is that? Then they're at a loss, right? And that's an indication that they lack an account. They can't explain what they believe and why they believe it. But the humanly wise person, of whom Socrates is our archetype here in this dialogue, right? They're one who recognizes the fact that they lack an account, right? They recognize this lack in their own worldview, in their own psyche, right? Okay, now the other kind of wisdom that Socrates discusses just in passing is what he indicates as a kind of divine wisdom, right? It's a person who has some skill or know-how. They have a full account of this skill or know-how, and they also recognize the fact about themselves that they have a full account of this, right? So as I said, Socrates suggests that the craftspeople in the city, like the stonemasons, the carpenters or woodworkers, the shoemakers or cobblers, the farmers, all of these people are probably divinely wise whenever it comes to their specific craft, right? Well, maybe not all of them, but at least some of them are divinely wise with regard to their specific craft, right? Like the old man who's been growing wheat his entire life successfully, right? And who, whenever you ask him, hey, why do you plant the wheat in this way at this time? Why do you water it only this much instead of more or less, right? He can give an account for all of this. He can explain to you why he does all of this, right? He would be divinely wise is a wheat grower, okay? Now imagine someone who's not only divinely wise as a wheat grower, but is divinely wise about all of their skills and know-how. Right? This would be someone who, if he were asked by Socrates, hey, what is piety? What do you think piety is? This person could articulate their conception of piety and justify it as the correct conception. If this person were asked, what is justice? This person could articulate what they think justice is, and they could justify this conception of justice. They could make you see why their conception of justice is the true conception, right? It's this kind of person that Socrates has in mind when he's referring to the divinely wise individual. Now, the person that's blameworthy, that has blameworthy ignorance, notice the first two characteristics on their list are exactly the same as the first two characteristics on the list of the humanly wise person, right? Both are people who have some skill or know-how, but they lack a full account of this skill or know-how. The distinguishing characteristic of the blameworthy ignorant person, however, or I'll just say ignorant person, right, is that they somehow do not recognize the fact about themselves that they lack a full account, right? They're in this unhappy position of not really knowing why they're doing what they're doing, of not really knowing why it's good to live their life in the way that they do, but nevertheless thinking that they do know that, okay? That's the position of the ignorant person. They think they know what is worthwhile in their life, and they think they know something worthwhile about that, but really they don't, and they just can't see it. Okay, now within this framework, we can begin to get a sense of what philosophy, as Socrates practices it, is, right? First, philosophy, as Socrates understands it, is the perpetual fight against ignorance to achieve human wisdom. Let's go back to this chart here, right? In other words, Socrates, it seems, assumes or thinks, I shouldn't say assumes, but he thinks that most of us are ignorant most of the time, right? I think in discussion section we'll talk about this point, right? Like, why think that most of us are blameworthy, ignorant people most of the time? Like, why should we think that, right? You should think about that question. But he thinks that most of us are in this position most of the time, and that what philosophy does is it tries to drag us from the position of the blameworthy, ignorant person over to the humanly wise person. In other words, it basically tries to get us to recognize the fact that we really don't have a full account of all of our life, of all of the things that we can do and actually do. And I think there's sort of like another step in his conception of philosophy, and that ultimately this perpetual fight against human wisdom will put us in a position where we can then begin the pursuit of divine wisdom, right? It's sort of like what happens in the move from blameworthy ignorance to human wisdom is we move from the position of having a whole lot of things that we don't know about ourselves, right? We could say, following Donald Rumsfeld, as much as I despise that guy, he has a really nice phrase. He says, there are these things about the world that are unknown unknowns. In other words, there are things that we don't know that we don't know that we don't know, right? That's the position of the blameworthy ignorant person. And what happens in the transition from blameworthy ignorance to human wisdom is that we move from the zone of unknown unknowns into a zone of known unknowns, right? Now we're in a position where we know what we don't know, right? And that's what the transition from blameworthy ignorance to human wisdom basically is. But there's also this other element, right? I mean, ultimately what we want to do is move from the known unknowns to make everything into the known knowns, right? The things that we know and that we know, right? And that's ultimately, I think, what philosophy is designed to do, right? It's designed to put us in a position, ultimately, where we can be divinely wise. Now, Socrates doesn't talk about this aspect of philosophy in the Apology, right? But he does talk about it in another dialogue that's called the Phaedo. And I'm not assigning anything from the Phaedo. It's a gorgeous dialogue, and I strongly recommend that all of you believe it. All of you read it before you die. Because in this dialogue, he characterizes philosophy as basically a kind of training for death, right? It's a training to put yourself in a position where you can achieve divine wisdom. And Plato suggests in the Phaedo that we'll never really be divinely wise in this life, that there's a certain sense in which our physical bodies keep us from being able to achieve that, and that we'll really only achieve it after death. Okay, that's at least the picture that he argues for. But whether those details about it are true or not, the general structure of it seems clear, right? The first stage of philosophy is the fight against blameworthy ignorance. The second step of philosophy is the move to divine wisdom, right? So there you have it. I'll gladly see you all later. I'm looking forward to today's discussion.